ask me, neuroscientist, opera singer, how do you, those two things are so very different. And I try to explain to them that actually they're kind of the same. They have the same ultimate goal, which is to understand what it means to be human. And in this particular time, on this particular earth, science is just interested in trying to find general principles that apply to everyone that we can all agree on objectively. And art uses personal experience to illuminate what's universal. So ultimately the goal is the same, but the methods sometimes are different. Sometimes they're quite similar. So my interest in the neuroscience of music really comes down to fundamentally what can it tell me about being human, and what can it tell me that will make me a better performer, because that's what I love to do. I love to perform for people. So in order to answer that question, we first need to agree on what we mean when we say music. What is it? It seems like a pretty simple question, but when you start to ask people to give you a definition of music, it's a little bit difficult, since there are so many different ways in which music is played and expressed and loved. So some people say it's organized sound, and that seems to capture a lot of what music is, but for some of us doesn't quite get at the essence. So others say, well, it's organized sound with an intention, something that you communicate, whether it's an idea or an emotion or some kind of experience. It's getting a closer, but most people that I talk to say, look, I'm not interested in defining music, but I know it when I hear it. And that's that third definition that I would like to challenge for you now. So if you're in that camp, let me ask you, what is the difference then between speech and music? So sometimes we know that speech is set to music, but most of the time when we talk to each other, we don't actually consider that music, we consider that language. And in fact, these little cheesecakes up there, to remind me that in fact there's a big debate amongst neuroscientists about what is the purpose of music and how did our brains evolve to create music. So one of our greatest thinkers, Steven Pinker, has called music auditory cheesecake. So we didn't evolve to eat cheesecake, but cheesecake hits all the things that we evolved to enjoy in terms of our food intake, the fats and the sugars and so forth. So his argument is we didn't evolve to love music, music just hits those sweet spots. But there's a whole other group of people, also represented by some really amazing thinkers like Jared Diamond, for example, who suggest that in fact music came before language. And not only did music help us to express our emotions with each other in a way that predates language, but also that it happens the same way in development. And that's why when we learn to speak as infants, we actually learn to track the melody, the prosody of a mother or a caretaker's voice before we actually learn the vocabulary. So in fact, somewhat, I should say, in these days, gender biasly, we call it motherese when we talk to our children. It's that sing-songy voice. So I'm more in that camp, but I'm still interested in understanding the relationship between speech and music because it's a place to start. So let's investigate that for a little bit. The first thing I want to play for you is just a simple sentence, and to see whether or not you feel that this is something that is musical or not.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely, they sometimes behave so strangely, 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 so strangely, so strangely, so strangely, so strangely.
So by the end of that, you probably started to hear Diana Deutsch sing. And let's hear the entire sentence again from the beginning.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible.
So there, we almost hear that just the part that we have repeated all of a sudden sounds like singing. And this is Diana Deutsch's voice. She's a professor at UCSD. And she discovered this speech-to-sound illusion, and it's in some ways changed what we think of as music. Now, music, then, by this very objective definition, is simply repeated speech. And so I'll put that out there for you in a moment. But first I want to explore some of the reasons why repetition might lead to us hearing something as music, and whether or not repetition is something that is important for musicians to understand, and how this focus on repetition has changed as music has changed over the centuries. So first we need to get to a little bit of a primer of what's going on with the brain. So your brain is made up of about 86 billion neurons, give or take a few in the last count. And here's a beautiful image of all of the ways in which those neurons are connected with each other. This is an image of all the tracks. And what this image shows is that one of the key features of the brain is not simply that it's made up of a lot of cells, but rather that these cells are connected one to another. And in fact, unlike all the other organs in our body, or most of them anyway, brain cells don't regenerate. They don't divide the way that other cells in our bodies do. We're born with a certain amount, and within the first year of life, our brain size triples. And then thereafter, it only increases by another 20% up until we get into our late teens, early 20s, when the brain is considered fully developed. And there's no such thing as a lazy neuron. If a neuron in the brain does not have a connection with another neuron, it dies. So all of that connectivity is something that happens during our development, and in fact is necessary for neurons to continue to survive. And it's interesting that even sometimes in certain cases, when that pruning fails, we actually get diseases. So for example, people who are born blind often have a thicker part of their brain that is usually involved in vision, because they haven't had that experience of pruning the unnecessary cells. So the brain works in terms of its connections, and one of the things that our brains are very good at is detecting patterns in the world and making associations with things. In fact, that's what I would argue is one of the reasons why we have evolved such brains, because we want to understand what is the regular in the environment, what is predictable, so that we can base our next decision on that basis. We can predict what's going to happen next, and we can make better decisions as a result. And in fact, this is such a strong urge for us in our minds that we even err on the side of seeing patterns where they're actually not there, especially if they can be related to something that is important to us, like, for example, faces. We see faces in all kinds of places where they simply aren't there and they're not meaningful. And in fact, there's a little surge of enjoyment when we see something and see a pattern in something that otherwise is chaotic. So I, along with some other of my colleagues, make the argument that one of the pleasurable aspects of listening to music is finding those patterns and recognizing them, and then being able to predict what might happen next. And that allows you to sort of track what the musicians are trying to express. And there's a few leaps there that I've made, but hopefully by the end of this talk we'll have gotten there. So to explore this repetition and pattern detection in music, I want to turn to a very nice study done by a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Margulis, who, if you're interested in this topic, has written a wonderful book called On Repeat, How Music Plays the Mind, and it's really well worth picking up. But in one of her studies a couple of years ago, she took two contemporary classical art song composers. So if you go to any conservatory in the country, people will know, yes, these two people are very famous in the classical music world, Elliott Carter and Luciano Berio, but their music isn't particularly tractable. That is, it didn't become one of the top 10 hits that's played on, the major radio stations in the US or elsewhere, but they are considered to be one of the, some of the pillars of at least classical contemporary music. And what Elizabeth did is she took pieces written by these two composers, and all she did was take out little snippets of them and add repetitions within the pieces. So she altered them in that way, and then she played these slightly hacked versions of pieces by these two composers to people who had no particular experience with contemporary classical music. So an average of people from the street and so forth. People like that? No, I'm just kidding. So then they asked in those individuals 3 questions. First, how much did they enjoy listening to the piece? Did they find it interesting? And finally, was it composed by a human being? Those are the 3 questions. And she compared their responses to these 3 questions on tracks that had the hacked repeated insertions versus tracks that didn't. And it turned out that lay people said they enjoyed them better if they had repetitions. They found them more interesting, and they were more likely to be composed by a human being. And in fact, when she presented these results at a major conference amongst music conservatory professors, some of them actually sheepishly admitted that they did also like the repeated versions more than the original versions, which is an entire other story. So there is something about repetition that makes us enjoy music, and I'm not saying necessarily that if we want that the goal of musicians must always be to elicit pleasure in our listeners. I mean, there's something to be said for music that challenges us. But before I go too far into that direction, which actually I'm not going to do much about in this particular talk, I want to just play you an example of a quintessential piece that is very famous and has a lot of repetition in it. And in fact, this particular composer, none of his other pieces have reached this kind of fame, and none of them have this repetitive component to it. So let's have a listen. Bolero. It's his by far most famous piece, and most people who've never heard of Ravel recognize this piece. And part of the reason is, of course, it's repeated almost relentlessly. And so I'd like to delve a little bit more deeply into why he wrote this piece with such relentless repetition, why it's so different from his other pieces, and why it is that it's become his most famous piece. Now, that last part, I've essentially tried to argue up until now that it is because of the repetition. It becomes immediately accessible to people by the end of this piece. It's 15 minutes long. I've probably played you 1 minute of it, and you already know how it's going to end, right? It's going to be a huge climax. That melody is going to come back and back and back again, and so forth. Well, when Ravel wrote this particular piece, here he is, very dapper man, he had just started to show symptoms of a brain degenerative disease. And that particular disease affects the speech production area in particular. It's called cortical basal degeneration. Now, we don't have access to a full neurological examination of Maurice Ravel's brain. So there's a little bit of speculation here, but a lot of neurologists have looked at historical records of the symptoms that he showed, the progression of his disorder, and have agreed that it's most likely that in fact he suffered from cortical basal degeneration. This particular disease has a couple of hallmarks. One, it's that the ability to express oneself using language deteriorates. And when you can no longer express yourself using language, it's extremely frustrating. And people find other outlets in which to communicate with other people. But one of the other side symptoms of this particular disease is a perseveration, a kind of doggedness, a compulsion. And that kind of compulsion actually is a desirable symptom in a lot of us who are artists. I mean, it's that kind of compulsion that keeps us doing things that, might not bring us wealth and fame and love and, all that good stuff, but it also allows us to do the kind of work that we want to do and produce the kind of work that we feel we are capable of. Now, it's unfair for me to take Ravel's Bolero and put it against a piece that he wrote 20 years earlier, because of course you would see a big transition in terms of a composer's lifetime. But let me instead put it next to a piece that he composed just a couple years earlier, which are the Chansons Maricas, which are some of my favorite pieces to sing ever. And even if you just look at the sheet music, the Bolero looks like it's perseverative, it's got this like real kind of quality of compulsion. And it looks very different on the page from the Chansons Maricas. But it's not that the Chansons Maricas don't have repetition within them. In fact, he only uses there are 3 songs, in each song he only uses maybe 4 or 5 notes, 4 or 5 tones, pitches. And what he's doing is just wrapping them in different patterns over and over and over again. And the beauty of the songs comes from the fact that you start to understand the tonality, and yet he pulls you into some very subjective human experiences, very specific human experiences in these songs, simply by replaying the way these tones are performed. So, for example, the first song is a love song about a man or a woman who's waiting for her or his lover to come, and there's a kind of real passion and desire, and it's just wonderful. The second one is a war cry, where it just completely wakes you up if you're at a recital and you're taking a little nap. And it really captures the anger of a populace that has been colonized or oppressed in some way. And finally, the last song is just what it feels like when it's super hot out and you just want to lie under a tree and have someone sing to you. And so he captures these very kind of specific and quintessential human experiences simply by manipulating the way these tones, or these patterns of tones are put together. When people asked about the Bolero and what he thought and why he wrote it, he actually said that he was influenced by factories, and he wanted it to sound relentless. In fact, he got into an argument with Toscanini. I mean, if Toscanini decides to play your piece, you say, "Great," and you sit down and shut up, right? But in this case, there was a performance in which Toscanini played his Bolero, and then Toscanini said, "The composer's in the audience." And Ravel refused to stand up. And why did he refuse to stand up? Because Toscanini had not followed his instructions. Toscanini had added an accelerando. He had made the piece move forward, which for a lot of musicians, these tempo changes, the push and pull, is actually what makes music music. And Toscanini did not want to have it sound like a machine in a factory. He wanted it to build, and he wanted to use the push and pull that we consider to be musical. And Ravel was absolutely abhorred by that. He did not want it to sound like that at all. So this brings me to the question of what it was about the disease that caused this kind of perseveration, this kind of perhaps obsession with sort of this factory kind of setting. And in an interesting stroke of fate, at the Memory and Aging Center, where I did my postdoctoral fellowship here at UCSF, we saw a patient who had the exact same disorder. She also had a non-fluent aphasia, it's called, an inability to produce language, ultimately. And she was a biologist, and she was an amateur painter. So 12 years before her diagnosis, she would paint very nice pictures of scenes. They're very nice, but they're not particularly interesting. They're kind of just a realistic depiction of what she's seeing with her eyes. As her disease progressed, and even though she hadn't yet been diagnosed, those symptoms are there. So somewhere around maybe 5 or 6 years before diagnosis, she was probably in the same boat as Ravel was when he wrote the Bolero. He wrote the Bolero almost 10 years before he died. And that's about, she died about 5 years maybe after her diagnosis. And so all of a sudden, the picture's more interesting, but it's different, right? Now she's got these flowers that are, around the house, so it's a little bit more abstract. And her art kept getting more and more abstract until she painted one of her masterpieces. And unbeknownst to her, she didn't know that Ravel had suffered from this disease, but she was fascinated by the Bolero. And this painting represents the Bolero. In fact, every square is a part of the melody coming back and back and back, that building. And so you can actually see a visual scape of the Bolero. And if I had 20 extra minutes, I'd play the whole Bolero and track you exactly how it's building and building, and how each one of those rectangles represents a return to that theme. So she found inspiration in the exact piece that mirrored a person who was suffering from her condition, which is a really interesting twist of fate. So why is it then that we find this particular piece as a popular culture so compelling? And I would argue that because it only takes one listen to understand and be able to predict that pattern. The relationship between our pleasure with hearing music and its complexity is an inverted U-shaped curve. So you just unpack that for a minute. The more complex the music, the more we like it, but up to a point. Only if we can understand it. Only if it sort of makes sense to us and we can see the patterns in it. Once it becomes too complex, we don't find the same kind of enjoyment in it anymore. In fact, this is one of the reasons why we have so many arguments amongst people about which genre of music is really the best, right? Because you might have someone who's a jazz aficionado who's listened to a lot of jazz and can go into a jazz club and hear a riff within a very complicated set of sounds. And if you're a jazz novice, you can't track the riff. You can't predict that pattern. You don't know where the person is going, and it just kind of sounds like gobbledygook to you. So that is how our relationship with music is built. It's built on our experience. And the more experience we have with a particular genre, the more complex a piece can be that allows us to enjoy it. And as a performer, I have to say that I have dedicated at least 50% of my performing time to presenting work by living composers. It's really important to me to present work by people that are alive in my era, in my culture, in my time, as opposed to just dead white guys, whom I adore and perform a lot, the other 50% of the time. And when someone hands me a piece of music, sometimes it doesn't even look like music to me. And I know that I must reserve judgment and not make a decision until I have sat with that piece of music for a while, until I have given it enough of a chance to have it repeated and to then see whether or not I can relate to what's going on. So this brings me to trying to then understand how it is that we have a sort of a personal relationship with music. And there's one other piece of music by another American composer this time that has become by far his most famous piece, although also, just like Ravel, it's not considered his best piece or his masterpiece in the contemporary classical music world. And that is the Adagio for strings by Samuel Barber. It also has this kind of melody that is very prevalent and that it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. And in fact, it's been played in memorial services many, 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 many times. Although, interestingly, Barber himself did not want it played at his own funeral. I guess he didn't want it to be associated with memorials exclusively. But there's an entire book stating that it's the saddest music ever written. And there is something really sad about the Adagio for strings. But one of the things that the Adagio for strings can do for a lot of us that a lot of other pieces can't do is give us what we call the chills. So the Adagio for strings is one of the pieces of music that is most likely to give you goosebumps. And some people would argue that getting the chills from listening to music is the ultimate sublime experience, that is what we look for at times when we listen to music. Now, again, we can listen to music for a number of different reasons. We can, listen to it for intellectual purposes, to get us moving, just as to help us decide which brand we should buy clothing from, and so forth, even though it's usually not conscious when we use music in that way. But when we have this active listening experience and it gives us the chills, the goosebumps, that seems to be one of the sublime experiences. Now, scientists love this for one reason only. We don't need you to tell us that you're enjoying music when you get the chills. We can measure it. We can see it in your body. So we don't need to worry about your subjectivity or your desire to please us or any of these other confounds that might get in the way. In fact, we can just look at your biology and tell you when you're experiencing the chills. This is a great thing for scientists. So, for example, here are a number of different measures that we can use. We can use your heart rate, how deeply you're breathing, your temperature, your blood pressure, etc. And we can see exactly when the chill happened. You don't need to tell us, we can see it. And then we can see what's going on in your brain when that happens. But first, one of the things that we've done is try to figure out what are the characteristics of music that are more likely to give us the chills. And it turns out there is a kind of conglomeration of features that are more likely to induce chills. And these are often a subito forte, so a big increase in dynamics that comes in suddenly, that in general usually marks a change in emotion or an increase in emotion or a welling up. So you just keep that in mind, that there's some kind of intention that we can read from a subito forte. The addition of a new voice, especially a treble voice. Thank God, because I'm a soprano. The return of the melody or the theme. So here we get to repetition. The aspect of us being able to detect that pattern. The melody comes back and our brain goes, ah, I know that pattern. That sounds familiar. An abrupt change in tempo, texture, or harmony, which also indicates a change in intention. And finally, sad music is much more likely to give you the chills than up-tempo or happy music. And if you think about Barber's Adagio for strings, it hits virtually every single one of these points. So, when we look at people who are getting the chills from music, there's one more thing that we find out, and that is that the chills are very subjective. So just because you might get the chills from the Adagio doesn't mean that I will. Depending on what my experience has been with music. So your experience with music will dictate whether or not you will get the chills. It's very unlikely that you would get the chills from a piece that's in a genre that you have no experience with. Okay, so that's great because that allows us to put people in a brain scanner and compare trials in which they are listening to exactly the same music, but they are not, or they are getting the chills. So here's just on the left-hand side the physical measures of whether a person is getting the chills, and same thing kind of on the right-hand side. But in this case, the first two rows refer to one subject for whom a Rachmaninoff piece gave them the chills, but the Barber Adagio left him cold. And the person on the bottom had the opposite response. So now we can compare the brain activity of the person who's getting the chills from the Barber with the brain activity of the person who's listening to the Barber but not getting the chills, and vice versa. That way we have the same, everything else is equal in terms of what kind of stimulus the person is getting. The only thing that's different is whether or not they're experiencing the chills. And this is one of these studies that in some ways people say, wow, why do people do science? They just show us what we already know. So it is true that in fact when you get the chills, the pleasure centers in your brain seem to light up. So these are your dopaminergic pathways. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that your brain cells use to communicate with each other. But it can have 3 different functions, at least, that we know of. It has 5 different ways of interacting with other cells in the brain, but if it's released in the front of your brain, it's usually involved in helping you track what's important in the environment. If it's released in the middle of your brain, that's what gives you a signal that there's something out there that's pleasurable. And then there's another region, if it's released there, it helps you initiate and control movement. And in fact, when we listen to music and are moved by it, all 3 systems are activated. But I want to zero in for now on the pleasure center and what happens. And in a follow-up study, we actually looked at and tracked at the time at which dopamine is released, in particular in this pleasure center. But before I get to the results of that particular study, I need to give you a little bit more background on what it is that helps our brain sort of sort of function, and getting back to this notion that, you know, part of the reason that our brains have evolved the way they are is in order to help us detect patterns. So if you look at this particular image, it looks like pretty calm and pretty simple, and if you had no other information, you would think, well, this person is just on a lake and having a nice day fishing. But if I told you there was a monster lurking in that lake, all of a sudden you have a completely different experience of this particular picture. And if I played some string music, you'd start to feel fear for this person. You'd start to anticipate that something bad is going to happen. And in fact, Hitchcock has said that the whole element of suspense is that the audience knows something that the characters in the movie do not. They are anticipating something, they're predicting it, and that's enjoyable. We want to do that again and again and again, because of course that not only allows us to enjoy a Hitchcock movie, but also hopefully allows us to escape from the tiger in the jungle or so forth, or whatever else we evolved to escape from. So the question then is, if you know the ending of a story though, if you know what's going to happen, is this still pleasurable? If you know exactly where the person is going, if you know Mozart is going to end the opera with a big cadence and 3 chords, like, do you really need to sit through the whole opera in order to get there? And the truth is that in fact you do, because your enjoyment of the piece actually is not diminished by knowing the ending. So this is a wonderful study by Jonathan Levitt and Nicholas Christenfeld, where they looked at stories, and they had a number of participants in which they told them the ending of these stories, or they didn't, and then they asked them to rate how much pleasure they got from actually reading the stories. And despite what Facebook and Twitter and all these other spoiler alert social media companies will tell you, the spoilers didn't spoil the stories. In fact, they did the opposite. When you looked at the mean pleasure rating of the spoiled stories, so these are the gray bars, the mean pleasure rating was as high or greater, significantly greater, in the spoiled stories versus the unspoiled stories, even when they were ironic twist stories. Think Sixth Sense, even though you know that he's a ghost. What does it make you do? Rewind to the beginning of the movie and watch it all again. And it's even more enjoyable. Why is that the case? That's the case, maybe, partly, I would suggest, because the pleasure center in your brain is tracking your sense of anticipation. And the greater the anticipation, the greater the pleasurable response. So getting back to our study of the chills, when we look at the 2 parts of the brain that are involved in pleasure, we have the nucleus accumbens and the caudate. The nucleus accumbens here is in the dark bar, in the dark line, and the caudate is in the light blue line. And you'll notice that when you're anticipating a pleasurable event, you have more activity in the caudate. And when the pleasure actually happens, when you experience the pleasure, you get more activity in the nucleus accumbens. That's your shot of dopamine. Now let me explain to you what these other regions are involved in when it comes to our pleasure. So if you take a hit of cocaine, your nucleus accumbens is going to be off the scale. It's going to show a lot of activity. You're going to get a lot of pleasure out of that. But when you become a cocaine addict and you walk into the room in which you take cocaine, your caudate is going to be active because it's going to anticipate this response. In fact, the job of your caudate is to figure out what it is in the environment that's going to give you this shot of pleasure. So if you don't set up the caudate properly, if you don't set up the expectation of pleasure, especially when it comes to these endogenous dopamines, so when it comes to your brain creating this excess of this particular chemical in your brain, you don't get as big a leap. If the brain's not expecting it, it doesn't prepare for it, it doesn't give you that big leap. But if you expect it, man, and you get that, and you're able to hold that expectation long enough that it can correspond with that relief, then you get a much bigger response. This is important for performers to know because that allows us to understand why building up tension in a piece is so important before we release it. You don't want to just surprise people with the big ending. You want to build up that tension. Okay. So why might that be the case? One theory comes from the idea that we evolved, our brain size increased, presumably because our skull size increased, around the time that we started living in bigger and bigger groups. In fact, the biggest change in our skull size happened when we moved from being in small groups, just a couple of people, to living in what is essentially the type of group size now that we live in, which is about 150 individuals. And if you look at the ratio of the part of your brain that is really kind of considered new or neocortex or uniquely human, or there's a number of different ways to explain it, describe it, that ratio, the larger the group size of any primate group, the larger that ratio, and the humans are sort of off the chart on that. So some people argue that a lot of the ways in which the brain has evolved has been to allow us to navigate social relationships. That that's actually one of the things that is most important to us. That's why one of the reasons that people die earlier than they should have is because they no longer have a social support system. We actually can see that even taking care of a plant can increase someone's lifespan. Music is great at creating social bonds. How many other events can bring a group of people this diverse and this large together and have them screaming their heads off if it isn't music? So what is it about music that helps us connect with one another? So I will make the argument that one of the things that we love about music is that it allows us to see the intentions and emotions of another person in a way that language doesn't. And so, to get to that part, we want to understand how it is that we can learn to see intentions and emotions in others. And here's a little baby monkey who's mimicking what he sees a human being do. And so there is a system in both our brains and the brains of this little monkey that in order to understand that someone else has intentions and emotions, we need to put ourselves into that other person's shoes. Now here I'm going to talk about a system that is both revered and has been oversold in a lot of ways. So caveat out there, I will help you navigate this particular oversold neurobunk in a minute. But first let's talk about what we know. So there's a system called the mirror neuron system, in which neurons in the brain of one individual, one animal, one primate, one human being, fire in the same way when they're watching another individual performing an action with a particular goal, as they would be firing if they were the person who was actually doing that thing. So, for example, it's brain activity that helps us understand the intentions of others by observing their actions. So it was first seen in monkeys watching other monkeys behave. So a monkey does an action, gets a banana, there's a certain brain activity in there, but when a monkey sees that action performed by another person with the same goal and the same intention, that same brain region or those same neurons fire. Now, we have found these types of neurons in humans, and it's possibly part of the kind of system that doesn't develop properly in children with autism, which makes them delayed at understanding that other people have intentions and emotions in the same way. But here's the caveat. It's easy to confuse these specific neurons with the general principle. And the general principle simply is, in order for us to empathize with someone else, we first must put ourselves into their shoes. We must essentially emulate in our own brains what we think is going on in their brains. And that's what we see music as being particularly good at. So one of the other really wonderful, more recent studies investigating what is the difference between humans, say, versus computer-generated music speaks to this very system. So in this rather ingenious study, these two investigators took pieces not by Elliott Carter and Luciano Berio this time, but by Schoenberg and Webern, also two giants in the contemporary classical music world, and they just told their participants either that the music was generated by a human being or by a computer. That's the only difference in terms of what the people thought the music, or who the people thought the music was composed by. And then they asked their participants, how emotional did you feel when you listened to this particular type of music? And what did you think about when you listened to that music? It turns out, compared to the music that was composed by a human being versus a computer, there was no difference in the emotional valence that the listeners attributed to that particular piece of music. But there was a big difference in terms of whether or not they thought about the intentions and what the composer was trying to express with the music. They were much more likely to track intentions when they were told that the music was composed by a human being. And when we look at the parts of the brain that were activated that correlated with this perceived intention rating, we see what we call the human mirror neuron system active, or the part of the brain that is involved in attributing a mental state to someone else. So this is where we get to what is it about music that kind of engages us. And in one more study, the scientists here took a piece of a piano piece by Chopin and either played it in an expressive way or took out all the dynamic and tempo shifts and made it mechanical. And here I want to just pop out of the presentation just for a minute to get you to listen to these two different ways in which this music was played. So it's a Chopin etude. Let's start with the mechanical performance. Sorry, Allison. I know there's at least one pianist who's horrified in the room. But essentially, what they did is they took an expressive performance and they completely took out all of the tempo changes and all the dynamic shifts. And it sounds very mechanical to us. It sounds like a person who is learning to play the piano but has no musicality to it. So let's see if we can get to the expressive performance, on the other hand. When we look at the brains of individuals who are listening to the expressive performance, we can actually see that the brain activity tracks the tempo fluctuations and that the brain is actually responding very much to these differences in both tempo and dynamic. So let's see if we can get this to work. Oh, sorry, no, I'm still playing the piano performance, so let me just go into iTunes and make sure that's stopped. There we go. Oops. So I make the argument that in fact those tempo changes and those fluctuations and the clear differences in dynamics and so forth really indicate an emotional intention or an expression or an idea that the person who is playing is trying to express. And we do in fact see the same mental attribution areas activated that correlate with these fluctuations. It's not important for those of you who are not neuroscientists and aficionados to know the differences between these brain regions, but I'll just say simply that the parts of the brain that are involved in actually playing the piece are also activated. If you were actually playing the piece, you would actually see some of these same brain regions active. But we also have parts of the brain that are involved in assessing the intentions and emotions of others that are activated by these changes. So one of the things that I've been really interested in more recently is trying to understand what it is about different musical performances that make them more or less effective. And so I've started something called the Ensemble Project, in which I, along with my vocal chamber music group, Vocal Collective, I was very pregnant at the time. I was 60 pounds heavier. We wanted to play the same pieces under a number of different conditions that we thought would make them more or less musical. So So the conditions that we chose were the same as this particular experiment. So we took out all the tempo changes and all the dynamic changes for 2 different takes, which, by the way, was really hard to do and very unsatisfying from the perspective of the musicians. We felt like we were shouting the whole time in the no dynamics. And the tempo changes, we just physically couldn't do it. So we decided that we'd only go with strict tempo changes as written. Like we could not just play the piece at 1 tempo. So instead we just did them as written, but without any transition, without any rubato, which is that kind of push and pull. We also felt it wasn't particularly musical. But we also had manipulations in which we had forced eye contact with one another. So we actually would stare at each other to make the audience feel as if we're really connecting. But it was like to the point where it was embarrassing. So we weren't really connecting. And so we wondered then if when we performed it under these conditions, whether people would think they were more or less musical. And finally, there was a condition in which we couldn't see each other at all. We had put up barriers, and so we had no eye contact. And at first we thought that would be the worst performance, but in fact we really had to listen. So without biasing you too much, I'd love to have you come and take the surveys. You can either watch the videos or you can just listen to the audio, depending on what you prefer. And right now we only have 1 piece up. It's the Chanson Perpétuelle by Ernest Chausson. It's a 6-minute piece. There are also, we eventually will put up just the quartet alone, played a number of excerpts from various string quartets and so forth. And we also recorded music by a contemporary American composer named Osvaldo Golijov. But there's 6 different conditions, and you can watch any of them, and there's a survey afterwards that asks you whether you thought this was something that was emotionally evocative and how much empathy it generated in you. So with this project, my goal is to understand what it is about different musical performances that make them more or less effective, but also ultimately to understand what it is about playing in a group of musicians that gives us that sense of connectivity and gets us back to this idea that music really, in my opinion, predates language in terms of connecting us as human beings. So, thank you.